the idea of Marlowe as idol. And so we looked at that bit of how he's positioned, how he's sitting, what that kind of tells us about how Conrad views Marlowe at this point, that he is this Buddha without a lotus flower. He's been through these experiences, but he really doesn't understand what he's been through. And so we're going to take the whole paragraph there at the bottom of page 4. He says, mind, none of us would feel the devotion to efficiency. But these chaps were not much account really. They were no colonists. Their administration was merely a squeeze and nothing more, I suspect. They were conquerors, and for that you want only brute force. Nothing to boast of when you have it, since your strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. They grabbed what they could get for the sake of what was to be got. It was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a great scale, and men going at it blind, as is very proper for those who tackle the darkness. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea only. An idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea. And an unselfish belief in the idea. Something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. And so as he trails off, we go back to what's his purpose here. He's trying to explain how they, as Europeans, are different than the Romans. And he specifically says, well, they're just conquerors. He says, what saves us is the idea only. This idea at the back of it. What's the idea? Exactly. Marlowe is pointing to the fact that white man's burden is what separates the European imperialism from the old school conqueror mentality. In their mind, they are going to civilize. They are spreading religion. They are doing good. Whereas, Romans, it was just like robbery. It was just murder on a grand scale. He's like, oh no, but we have a difference. He's not saying this sincerely. There is that bit of indictment. There is that sarcasm that's present in what he is saying. We need to recognize it and know that it's going to infect the story that is to come. Now, the next paragraph up here at the top, followed by what's going to follow, really the one at the top, is very literal. Don't get lost. And as we start here, we're going to chunk a couple of paragraphs because Marlowe's just going to start telling his story. And so everything he's going to say here on page 5 for the most part is literal. It's easy to follow. You'll be like, oh, this is what I've been waiting for. Thank God. Marlowe broke off. Flames glided in the river, small green flames, red flames, white flames, pursuing, overtaking, joining, crossing each other, then separating slowly or hastily. The traffic of the great city went on in the deepening night upon the sleepless river. We looked on, waiting patiently. Well, there was nothing else to do till the end of the flood. But it was only after a long silence when he said in a hesitating voice, I suppose you fellows remember I did once turn freshwater sailor for a bit, that we knew we were fated before the ebb began to run to hear about one of Marlowe's inconclusive experiences. Well, I don't want to bother you much with what happened to me personally, he began, showing in this remark the weakness of many tellers of tales who seem so often unaware of what their audience would best like to hear. Yet to understand the effect of it on me, you ought to know how I got out there, what I saw, how I went up that river to the place where I first met the poor chap. It was the furthest point of navigation and the culminating point of my experience. It seemed somehow to throw a kind of light on everything about me and into my thoughts. It was somber enough, too, and pitiful. Not extraordinary in any way. Not very clear either. No, not very clear. And yet it seemed to throw a kind of light. So you will notice that these paragraphs begin with quotation marks. You're going to notice that as we flip through, the rest of the pages, the rest of them will. As Marlowe continues to narrate, he's just going to talk and talk and talk and talk. And very rarely will we see the narrator interject or the outside world stop it. I want to stop just to point out this thing that he's bringing up. He mentions that this experience that he is going to talk about when he was a freshwater sailor, meaning Congo River, says it through a kind of light. Past tense. That it threw a kind of light. So far, we've seen light and dark be used as this initiating thing of tone early. We talked about the brooding gloom that's over the city, the luminous waterway that's the river. We've set the tone with it, but we're now kind of transitioning to this being more thematic. When he's talking about this throwing a kind of light on everything, he's talking about light as illumination, understanding, enlightenment, and of course, darkness being something different. And he kind of began that conversation over on page 4? Yeah. When he talks about what they face, these guys that go out and face the darkness. So he's now beginning this turn. And as we go through the book, look for these moments he's going to talk about light, and these times he's going to talk about darkness because it's important. He's going to continue to talk about his own background. He says, I had then, as you remember, just returned to London after a lot of India Ocean, Pacific, China Seas, a regular dose of the East, 6 years or so. And I was loafing about, hindering you fellows in your work and invading your homes, just as though I had got a heavenly mission to civilize you. You know, it was very fine for a time, but after a bit, I did get tired of resting. Then I began to look for a ship. I should think the hardest work on earth. But the ships wouldn't even look at me. I got tired of that game too. Now, when I was a little chap, I had a passion for maps. I would look for hours at South America or Africa or Australia and lose myself in all the glories of exploration. At that time, there were many blank spaces on the earth. And when I saw one that looked particularly inviting on a map, they all look that, I would put my finger on it and say, when I grow up, I will go there. The North Pole was one of these places, I remember. Well, I haven't been there yet and shall not try now. The glamour's off. Other places are scattered about the equator and in every sort of latitude all over the two hemispheres. I've been in some of them and, well, won't talk about that. But there was one yet, the biggest, the most blank, so to speak, that I had a hankering after. True, by this time it was not a blank space anymore. It had gotten filled since my boyhood with rivers and lakes and names. It had ceased to be a blank space of delightful mystery, a white patch for a boy to dream gloriously over. It had become a place of darkness. But there was in it one river especially, a mighty big river, that you could see on the map, resembling an immense snake uncoiled, with its head in the sea, its body at rest, curving afar over a vast country, and its tail lost in the depths of the land. And as I looked at the map of it in a shop window, it fascinated me as a snake would a bird, a silly little bird. Then I remembered there was a big concern, a company for trade on that river. Well, dash it all, I thought to myself, they can't trade without using some kind of craft on that lot of fresh water. Steamboats. Why shouldn't I try to get charge of one? I went on along Fleet Street, but could not shake off the idea. The snake had charmed me. All right, really basic. He introduces where this interest in exploration comes from. I always like to point out when he's, time period-wise, when he's talking about the blank spaces, literally, they had rough outlines of continents, but no details that went into them. So to him, it's the fascination of like, wow, we roughly know the outline of this place, but we don't know any of the details of what's going on in there. What would it be like to go? But he quickly tells you that the glamour's off. Because of his experience that he's retelling us of the Congo, he is no longer interested in the idea of exploration. He is no longer interested in finding out mysteries and stuff like that. Totally huge comment. Then we hear how he describes the Congo River, and he builds this metaphor. What's he compare it to? He describes just the shape of the Congo River as he looks at it on the map.
A snake?
A snake. Now, this is important because this isn't just functioning as a metaphor, it is also functioning as an illusion. The metaphor absolutely just gives us that idea of, okay, we get it, like it wiggles, it looks like a head, it looks like a tail. Visually, I got it. But when we introduce the idea of the illusion, it helps us to support the unspoken about the metaphor, what we're supposed to understand through the connection. Anybody familiar with the allusion here to snake and charming? So if you go back, most of the stuff that we're going to see that are allusions tend to be biblical in nature. You go back to the start of the Bible.
The snake in the tree?
Exactly. Adam and Eve and the snake. Devil takes the form of the snake. Eve is hungry like all women, all she wanted to eat. And now we have nothing. We're out of paradise. Thanks a lot, ladies. Look at the illusion here. Once we were able to bring in that idea, now we start to understand, okay, yeah, he's got the visual part, but when he's introducing these comments like the snake could charm me, is a bad thing. We're starting to get that concept of he was lured into something that now has, bit him back. The glamour's off. He doesn't care about exploration. He doesn't care about any of this anymore. And so that's really central to helping to see where we're going here. Now, the next paragraph introduces a concept we want to talk about really quick. He says, you understand it, and it here as a referencer goes back to the previous paragraph, and he's talking about the company that runs steamboats on the Congo River. He says, you understand it was a continental concern, that trading society, but I have a lot of relations living on the continent because it's cheap and not so nasty as it looks, they say. This gets kind of confused because people go, a continental concern? Marlowe, and by proxy Conrad, doesn't like to talk in specifics. And so with this book, he needs to globalize his commentary on imperialism. If he simply names the company that's in charge of trade on the Congo River, and he just goes after what's happening in the Congo, it would seem like he is simply indicting that one company rather than the concept as a whole. And so here, he doesn't want to tell you the country he's talking about, but he's starting to allude to it. They are in London. Then he talks about the continent. He's talking about Europe. A lot of people get confused and think when he talks about this being a continental concern, he's talking about Africa. The trade on the river is a European concern. And so he's going to start to focus his reader on the fact that he's going to talk about Belgium, but he's never going to use the word Belgium. And he's also never going to use the name of the capital of Belgium, which is where he is going to go shortly. And so this is why that active reading is so important. This helps you to focus if we can put these together. He says, I'm sorry to own I began to worry them. These are his relations. This was already a fresh departure for me. I was not used to get things that way, I always went my own road and on my own legs where I had a mind to go. I wouldn't have believed it of myself, but then you see, I felt somehow I must get there by hook or by crook. So I worried them. The men said, my dear fellow, and did nothing. Then, would you believe it? I tried the women. Charlie Marlowe, set the women to work to get a job. Heavens! We see the notion drove me. I had an aunt, a dear enthusiastic soul. She wrote, it'll be a delight. I'm ready to do anything for you. It's a glorious idea. I know the wife of a very high personage in the administration, and also a man who has lots of influence with, etc., etc. She was determined to make no end of fuss to get me appointed a skipper of a river steamboat, if such was my fancy. I got my appointment, of course, and I got it very quick. It appears the company had received news that one of their captains had been killed in a scuffle with the natives. All right, let's stop for a second. We need to address something that we haven't talked about yet. If you're looking at the paragraph, there is a word that's going to come up many, many, many times in this book. As a literature student, we need to talk about the N-word really quickly. Yes, it is racist. Yes, it is strong. But we need to at least read it with the text, but not use it in conversation. I know that seems really odd, but if we don't look at it as part of the book, if we simply like edit it and just, skip the word, we lose the strength and the purpose of the word in showing the message of the writer and the culture that produced it. And so don't get, we're going to use it, but we're going to use it in context, but we're not going to use it beyond that, if that makes sense. I always like to bring that up because otherwise you read right past it and everybody's just like, whoa, okay, we're going there. No, we're not. We're simply going to look at it here in the context. That's it. So he's going to talk about how he got his appointment here. He says, it appears the company had received news that one of their captains had been killed in a scuffle with the natives. This was my chance, and it made me the more anxious to go. It was only months and months afterwards, when I made the attempt to recover what was left of the body, that I heard the original quarrel arose from a misunderstanding about some hens. Yes, 2 black hens. Fresleven, well, that was the fellow's name, a Dane, thought himself wrong somehow in the bargain. So he went ashore and started to hammer the chief of the village with a stick. Oh, it didn't surprise me in the least to hear this. And at the same time, to be told that Fresleven was the gentlest, quietest creature that ever walked on 2 legs. No doubt he was. But he had been a couple of years already out there engaged in the noble cause, and he probably felt the need at last of asserting his self-respect in some way. Therefore, he whacked the old nigger mercilessly, while a big crowd of his people watched him, thunderstruck, till some man, I was told the chief's son, in desperation at hearing the old chap yell, made a tentative jab with a spear at the white man. And of course, it went quite easy between the shoulder blades. Then the whole population cleared into the forest, expecting all kinds of calamities to happen, while on the other hand, the steamer Fresleven commanded left also in a bad panic, in charge of the engineer, I believe. Afterwards, nobody seemed to trouble much about Fresleven's remains, till I got out and stepped into his shoes. I couldn't let it rest, though. But when an opportunity offered at last to meet my predecessor, the grass growing through his ribs was tall enough to hide his bones. They were all there. The supernatural being had not been touched after he fell. And the village was deserted. The huts gaped black, rotting, all askew within the fallen enclosures. A calamity had come to it, sure enough. The people had vanished. Mad terror had scattered them, men, women, and children, through the bush, and they had never returned. What became of the hens, I don't know either. I should think the cause of progress got them anyhow. However, through this glorious affair, I got my appointment before I had fairly begun to hope for it. Okay, there's a lot here that we want to unpack and talk about. First is the name. There's only 3 names in this whole book. Marlowe, the person he's going to meet in the jungle, Kurtz, and Fresleven. That's it. So when we see a name used this specifically, it's meant to draw our attention and be important. This is the guy that commanded the steamboat that Marlowe takes over before him. There's a couple of things we want to unpack in this story about Fresleven. First, let's talk about the literal. What happens to Fresleven? let's start with what's the fight even about? Two hens. Trivial, simple. But in this case, he clearly felt like he was wronged. And so who does he go after? So Fresleven goes after the chief. There we go. We see what happens between them, this fight that breaks out. But we have to talk about why the fight happens and what he says about Fresleven. He says that, yeah, Fresleven beats the heck out of this chief. But then he also says Fresleven's described as the gentlest creature that has ever been. You will notice that through the book there is a running thematic point that Africa changes Europeans. They don't quite know how, they don't quite have an idea on it, but time and again, we are going to see examples of Europeans being one way before they get there, and then Africa changes them into something different. And so here we see this gentle creature transformed through this slight with these two hens into this violent person. As he is beating the chief, how does he die? A spear from the chief's son. The word I want to focus on with this spear thing is how he's described as the action itself is a tentative jab. Okay, put yourself in the spot of the chief's son. You're watching your father getting beaten with a stick by this guy that came off of the boat. Think about to describe the action as a tentative jab. Do you think that the son came up behind him and was like, hey, dude, hey. And he takes this spear and he's just like, hey. Like just trying to poke him like you would if somebody was asleep on their desk. Like, hey, wake up. Do you really think that the son approached him with a tentative jab? And that magically, as Marlowe says, the spear just went right in, like, whoa, I didn't realize how sharp that was. No, not at all. You shouldn't at all walk away with this impression. Then why does Marlowe describe it this way? Think relationally here. If the son is shown in any way to be aggressive, who's in the wrong? The son, 100%. It's the son. If Marlowe describes it in any way where the son is aggressive, boom, he's wrong. We get it because of the use of the N-word in there and our understanding of the relations at the time. Does Marlowe know that this was a tentative jab? Was Marlowe watching this thing go down? No. So think about what that tells you about Marlowe as narrator. He's willing to indict Fresleven and show this change. Africa clearly changed this guy. As he tells the story, he understands that this fight was about nothing and seemingly stupid, because not only does he tell you about the two hens, but look at the end of the paragraph. After focusing on the effect on the people, he then goes, well, I don't know what happened to the hens either. It's laughable, but it shows you can laugh at it because he knows how to construct and tell this story for effect. He gets that this is stupid. He gets that Fresleven is in the wrong. He understands that Africa has changed him, but he wants to make clear that to the son, his tentative jab wasn't aggressive. He's not in the wrong. Now, of course, Fresleven dies. And what happens on both sides? What happens to the village?
They left.
They left. They all disappeared. I mean, think about it. Here, this tentative jab where he's just trying to get him to stop beating his dad, he ends up killing the white guy, and they all look around like, oh my God, we killed one of them. Notice that he describes Fresleven as a supernatural being. He's not. He's just a normal white guy. But it helps us to understand what the perception of the Europeans is by the native Africans. He's supernatural. Oh my God, we somehow killed one. Run away. We're going to be cursed. They're going to come and kill us all. But what does the Europeans do on the boat? Do they even go and collect Fresleven's body? They run away too, because they realize really quickly, oh my God, there might be like 5 of us, and there are a ton of them. We're all going to die if we don't leave. Let's go. Both sides have the same reaction. And meanwhile, Fresleven just rots away here in the grass, and Marlowe says all of his bones are still there. Like, wherever he dropped, like, he just rotted away, and that's it. We see the effect here, and that's what's most important, is it's giving us a lot of insight into how Marlowe tells stories, into some of the things he's going to focus on, like the fact that, hey, Africa changes the Europeans that are there. Hey, these Africans are not always in the wrong. And let me clear this one too, because I've already seen it in some of the writing. When we're talking about the natives, they are Africans, not African Americans. Those would be people in America, not in Africa. I'm only saying it because seriously, I've already seen some of the assignments come in and they're like, the African Americans in the Congo. And I'm like, oh, sweet baby angels. This is a great example though, and I like to spend the time with it because it starts to teach you how to read Marlowe's stories. Even for a story like this that he wasn't present for, his influence as storyteller and his perspective on situations comes through very strongly. And if we look for it, it can help. Now, when you did your context research, a name probably came up mostly because I told you to look for it. Did you find stuff from Chinua Achebe? I'm going to spell his name out because then you're going to be like, oh yeah, that guy. Achebe is a native African writer. And he comes from a perspective that we call post-colonial. So obviously colonization is where another culture comes in and, imposes their will. Post-colonial is the voice of those that were under that oppression, now realizing and reflecting on the text that was produced to look at the influence. Achebe became very famous because when he looked at the novel, to him, he sees Conrad as a racist. He looks at it from the perspective of, hey, look at how he's talking about these Europeans. Look at the actions that they're taking. Look at these things. I don't necessarily go one way or the other. I like to play devil's advocate with everything because as an analytical thinker and to get you to think analytically, it's good to sometimes take whatever side just to counterpose. Not that I agree with it. As we go through the novel, a question I always ask students to think is Conrad and Marlowe, are they actually racist? What kind of evidence do we see and how do we see things presented? Because it gets you to engage and to think. There's not going to be a right or a wrong answer here. He's not going to step forward and be like, I'm not. No. But it just is a way for you to look at the novel here. So he's told us how he gets this job, and he's filled us in on Fresleven. He's going to kind of continue to talk about getting ready. He says, I flew around like mad to get ready. And before 48 hours, I was crossing the channel to show myself to my employers and sign the contract. Of course, the channel is the English Channel that separates England from Europe. In a very few hours, I arrived in a city that always makes me think of a whited sepulchre. Prejudice, no doubt. And no difficulty in finding the company's offices. It was the biggest thing in the town, and everybody I met was full of it. They were going to run an overseas empire and make no end of coin by trade. Hard stop here. He crosses and goes to Europe. We now see him in Belgium. Of course, Belgium, Congo. Anybody know the capital of Belgium? Brussels. So he's in Brussels, but nowhere in the text is he ever going to use the name or refer to it. Instead, he says that this city reminds him of a whited sepulcher. Are you familiar with the word sepulcher? Do you know what a sepulcher is? So a sepulcher is a tomb. The fact that he describes it as a whited sepulcher gives a reader at the time a clear understanding that he's making another allusion to the Bible here. And so I've pulled it out. This allusion comes not from the Old Testament like the snake, but from the New Testament. And if you're not of a Christian persuasion, sorry, the lights went out. Come on. It's back that way. There it goes. Okay. If you're not of a Christian persuasion, you might not be familiar in the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Old Testament presents God as a vengeful being. I have created you and you continue to wrong me and I'll punish you. But by the time we get to the New Testament, we're presented with Jesus, the shepherd. He loves the little children. He loves everybody. We change the impression of how religion comes across. And often we tell stories through parable here in the New Testament. This is an example of that. The whited sepulcher reference comes from the book of Matthew, one of the four Gospels. The quote says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanliness." So if you're looking here, he says that this city of Brussels, the capital of Belgium, reminds him of a whited sepulcher. Beautiful on the outside, but we understand that inside it is corrupted and dirty and full of death. And so all of a sudden we're going, I see what you're saying, especially when you say that the company's buildings are the biggest in the city. Not only is it full of death, but this company is the center of it. He then goes on about traveling here into the city. A narrow and deserted street in deep shadow, high houses, innumerable windows with Venetian blinds, a dead silence, grass spurting between the stones, imposing carriage archways right and left, immense double doors standing ponderously ajar. I slipped through one of these cracks, went up a swept and ungarnished staircase, as arid as a desert, and opened the first door I came to. Two women, one fat and the other slim, sat on straw-bottomed chairs, knitting black wool. The slim one got up and walked straight at me, still knitting with downcast eyes, and only just as I began to think of getting out of her way, as you would for a somnambulist, stood still and looked up. Her dress was as plain as an umbrella cover, and she turned round without a word and preceded me into a waiting room. I gave my name and looked about. Deal table in the middle, plain chairs all around the walls. On one end, a large shining mat marked with all the colors of a rainbow. There was a vast amount of red. Good to see at any time, because one knows that some real work is done in there. A deuce of a lot of blue, a little green, smears of orange, and on the East Coast, a purple patch. Show where the jolly pioneers of progress drink the jolly lager beer. However, I wasn't going into any of these. I was going into the yellow, dead in the center. And the river was there, fascinating, deadly, like a snake. Oof! A door opened. A white-haired secretarial head, but wearing a compassionate expression, appeared, and a skinny forefinger beckoned me into the sanctuary. Its light was dim, and a heavy writing desk squatted in the middle. From behind that structure came out an impression of pale plumpness in a frock coat. The great man himself. He was 5'6", I should judge, and had his grip on the handle end of ever so many millions. He shook hands, I fancy, murmured vaguely, was satisfied with my French. Bon voyage! In about 45 seconds, I found myself again in the waiting room with the compassionate secretary who, full of desolation and sympathy, made me sign some documents. I believe I undertook, amongst other things, not to disclose any trade secrets. Well, I'm not going to. I began to feel slightly uneasy. You know, I'm not used to such ceremonies, and there was something ominous in the atmosphere. It was just as though I'd been let into some conspiracy. I don't know, something not quite right, and I was glad to get out. In the outer room, the two women knitting black wool feverishly. People were arriving, and the younger one was walking back and forth introducing them. The old one sat on her chair. Her flat cloth slippers were propped up on a foot warmer, and a cat reposed on her lap. She wore a starched white affair on her head, had a wart on one cheek, and silver-rimmed spectacles hung on the tip of her nose. She glanced at me above the glasses. The swift and indifferent placidity of that look troubled me. Two youths with foolish and cheery countenances were being piloted over, and she threw at them the same quick glance of unconcerned wisdom. She seemed to know all about them and about me too. An eerie feeling came over me. She seemed uncanny and faithful. Often far away there, I thought of these two, guarding the door of darkness, knitting black wool as for a warm pall, one introducing continuously to the unknown, the other scrutinizing the cheery and foolish faces with unconcerned eyes. Ah, old knitters of black wool. Moratori de salute. I'm going to totally mess that up. Not many of these she looked at ever saw her again. Not half, by a long way. What? Is it still going? Dang, it stopped. Oh no, it is still going. Good. Okay, quick hits. First, notice that he goes into this interview to work for the company. How long is the interview?
45 seconds.
45 seconds. They don't care about him. They just need a body. You breathing? You actually want to go? Cool. Sign the paper. Let's talk about the women in the waiting room. They're described as being like somnambulists, like they're sleepwalking. They're both wearing black. They're knitting black wool. He's bringing in another illusion here. And if you've ever seen the movie Hercules, you probably can guess it. Women wearing black wool, black thread, and they kind of decide out a length and then cut it. Have you ever seen Hercules? No? He's referring to the fates. The idea in kind of Greek and Roman mythology of these women who kind of measure out the span of your life and cut it. Notice they're guarding the door of darkness as though clearly this should be an idea that, hey man, you shouldn't continue here. To keep going would be bad. They seem to know what's going to happen because they've seen so many come through this office. He gets all the bad feelings, but notice he keeps going onward. What we are seeing is hindsight. As he revisits this, he realizes the ominous nature of it, and he encounters it with the Latin at the end. That phrase is actually what gladiators would say to the emperor before they went into the kind of gladiatory pit. Those about to die salute you. So it undercuts his feelings of an ominous nature here. We're going to continue tomorrow. We're going to get good old Marlowe to Africa, and we'll go from there.